Here we go. Um, Welcome. This is David Carle, and I'm re-recording the presentation I did for the Mono Basin Historical Society in August, early August. And so we're gonna get it done again. I'm speaking about a pertinent history of fire in Eastern California, and this is in part because just a few days ago, the second edition of one of my books was republished. Came out, Introduction to Fire in California, published by the University of California Press. So let's forge ahead here. What I'm going to do is talk about a little bit about fire in general and fire in California in general, but really try to focus on the Eastern California story, the story that's of more interest to the people who are involved with the Mono Basin Historical Society. So, you know, to begin with, fire is an element that we are all, is part of our world. It always has been. Humans early on in our evolution on this planet were the species that was able to figure out how to use fire and to utilize it for ourselves. And so it has is very much a benefit for us in many, many different ways. I've got a couple of pictures here of how we use it here locally in our heating, and if you're out camping, it's always nice to have a little fire when the conditions allow, which right now everybody should know in the year 2021 we don't have the conditions for doing a lot of fire burning because the fire season has gotten extreme. So just be aware of that. But we use fire in so many ways. We use it in ways that are hidden to us a lot, but are there, like little fires that are combusting in the engines of our motor vehicles as we burn gasoline. A lot of ways that we burn fuels that are of benefit to people. Out there in the California environment, fire is a natural thing. It started naturally, it has been for all time, by things like lightning, but also by people, not just accidentally, not as a disastrous kind of thing, but as part of a way of actually managing the land by the early people of California, the indigenous people. But fire can become a very scary thing and a very difficult thing to control. And so we have firemen, people whose jobs are to go out and deal with fire when it gets going and gets away. This is, of course, we have it in our cities. We have fire stations, and we have people that have been trained and given the equipment to deal with fire in that setting. And there are the agencies, the land management agencies. In particular, in our part of the world, we've got the U.S. Forest Service managing a lot of land and dealing with fire in the different ways they do. And we also have the Cal Fire, the California state agency that deals with fire on a lot of land, especially the private lands that aren't federal lands. And so maps have been prepared, identification has been done for people all across California to try to take a look and see where you live and how that fits into fire threat. And when these maps are put together, they're not just looking at the threat of fire in terms of what's the vegetation situation that is the fuel for fire. They're also looking at where are the people. So we're looking at the threat to humans. And so when you look at a map like this, if you know that most of the people in the state live on the coastal plain or else in the Sierra foothills, and you notice that there's a heck of a lot of this bright red stuff around those areas, especially Southern California. That's the chaparral fire threat that threatens the big cities of Southern California, the big wildland urban interface areas. That's the word. But take a look at Mono County, and if I can do this with my pointer, my mouse. Here's Mono County, and you notice there's not a whole lot of red here, but I'm going to click in closer and realize that, okay, so now here's Mono Lake, and here's Lake Tahoe, and here in what I was just circling a minute ago, you do see in the detail, there are areas that are highlighted as very high risk, and guess what? They're areas like down in Round Valley and north of us up heading up towards Topaz and into Nevada, where there's people and where there's not just a vegetation. This is mostly wildland I'm marking right here in the north of the Bodie Hills, but also people areas where there's communities. And so we've got, a little spot here. These are areas, where our Levining June Lake, and then as you go down south of us, there's you pick up some more, and this has to do with vegetation and people both. So so we live in a fire risky place. California is a place where fire is a natural phenomenon, and what we've added to that is the thing that there's almost 40 million people today living in the state, and many of us live in the wildland urban interface. So this picture was taken, 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago now, in February, which is a very unusual thing to see in basically in the winter, down in Round Valley. And this round fire got going on a night when the wind was blowing from an unusual direction, blowing out of the east, blowing very strong. And once it caught, we were in the midst of a drought in 2015. Then the fuels were dry, even though it was winter, and it raced very rapidly through an area where a whole bunch of homes were lost very tragically. And then it went up the mountain. A lot of this confusion of lights you see here glowing is actually beyond where the homes were and up on the Sierra front there, the east side of the Sierra, just burning up the hill until it ran out of fuel. So some of the other fires that do happen in the Eastern Sierra, despite that fire risk map that made it look like we really don't have a whole lot of risk compared to other places, we don't, but it's there certainly. So just a year ago in November, the Walker Fire happened, and this is another case where it got started and burned very rapidly, pushed by wind, and it impacted, in this case, real quickly, a number of structures. All the little round circles and colors here are structures, and the ones that are in red are the ones that were destroyed by this fire in a real short period of time before it got going, or before it got out. These kinds of things where it moves through an urbanized, if you think of Walker's urbanized, a community, they can happen, and these two fires that I just talked about, very fast. And then the wildland portion of it, if there's an element there, may go on and on and on. Like if you're watching the fire situation in 2021 this year, we've got fires now that have been burning for into months, and they will in those particular environments. But these house to house episodes are something else. And then just this year, just before I gave the first version of this talk, the Tamarack Fire got going up north of us, and I consider this part, an Eastern California fire for us. It is east of the Sierra Crest. It got going up near Grover Hot Springs State Park and the little town of Markleyville, and it burnt over the period of time over to the east and crossed over into Nevada up above Topaz. And just today I checked, and the more or less it looks like the final acreage is what I'm showing here, and they're saying 82% contained. This fire is essentially contained at this point, and there will be, as there always are, the lingering things that have to be watched for flare-ups. But the concern right now is farther north of us, and what's happening this year up towards Northern California with the Dixie Fire. And right now there's a fire burning south of Highway 50 that's affecting the El Dorado National Forest. So I want to focus in the next set of shots here on some local stuff in the Mona Lake Basin. And this is a pretty neat little map because it has all of these little details here with years, show different years of different relatively small fires in our region. Going back to, here's one in 1999. Just 2 years ago, we had a fire that was affecting us with some smoke and agency people in around to fight it and to deal with it. to nursemaid it really in 2019, called the Springs Fire. This is out south of Highway 120. So here's Mona Lake, South Tufa, Navy Beach, Highway 120 east, and over here to the west is Grant Lake on the June Lake Loop. So I want to show you what happened just this last year. We had this fire that came in, and I'm sorry, I've got my dates wrong. This is this year, the Dexter Fire this year, and how this one fits in. If you see, here's Highway 120, this little loop-de-loop here on Highway 120. That you'll notice this arc here kind of fits right into this area where I'm circling here in relation to earlier fires, including the Springs Fire. There's can be some crossover, but fires like this patchwork is an indicator of how if fires come too close or come in a short period of time after one has occurred, the fact that the fuels have been affected by that fire will affect the next fires. So here's the one I wanted to focus on. It's just kind of interesting and a little different. It's I would say a very natural occurrence that happened in the beach fire in the year 2020. Think back to 2020. That was incredibly interesting and scary and difficult fire year for California. In August 2020, there was this very unusual lightning strike episode across Northern California, and it is unusual. Here's a map of how the most likely occurrences are of lightning, and mostly it's in the eastern Sierra or eastern Sierra Nevada, east side of California. Down in the Four Corners area to the south, there'll be lightning associated with the monsoonal storms that come there. And most of the state looks like these blue colors, which means hardly any lightning. And yet this was the year where this, many tens of thousands of lightning strikes in a short time started fires that became mega complexes. Well, our own local episode there of lightning started fire was on August 16th, 2020. The beach fire started just south of Mona Lake, started by lightning, natural ignition, and then it came burning towards the west, out of the ignition source, out of those hills. So this picture now is the same fire getting going as and this picture was taken over towards off Highway 120 east. So the fire at this point, the front of it was moving towards just arriving in the Navy Beach, above a Navy Beach area of Mona Lake. It did just barely get into some of the South Tufa area. I'll show you some interesting photos in a moment. Thank you, Santiago Escruciera, the Mona Lake Committee employee who took this picture. So after the fire was out, a matter of days, there was a matter of months before the public was really allowed back into that area, and well, things were being dealt with. But I was able in September to go out on a boat on Mona Lake and take this picture looking back towards through the South Tufa, some of the Tufa area, and in the distance you see all of the darkened area, and you also see vegetation on the left there. So as I said, there were fingers of flame that came into this area, but mostly it burned up higher, up between South Tufa and the highway. So this was September 5th, just about two and a half weeks after the fire. This is October 25th, and off in the distance from here, you see the main South Tufa area. Navy Beach is behind me as I took this picture, and it was very interesting to watch and see what had happened down there, and we'll be watching that over time. It's an interesting fire ecology lesson actually to see. So in only between August and October, we had not yet had any rain or snow arrive, and yet this was already happening. The sprouting of the grass. This is the salt grass, and it has roots that are underground. This kind of grass, like some of the grasses that people grow in their yards, have rhizomes underground, the roots that run laterally side by side, and roots underground in most fires are not impacted by the heat of the fire, because heat rises, and there can be incredible heat and flame happening just above the surface or along the surface, but go down just an inch or more, and the ground is cool, and so the roots survive. And these grasses came right back. Now you notice the shrubs didn't, not yet, but that's going to, I'll show you some pictures in a minute. It takes a little longer for a shrub, if it has living roots, to sprout back. The other interesting thing, though, of course, is the tufa towers, and people will be the impact. Some of these pictures I'm showing right now are of towers that people didn't see very much because they were surrounded by tall shrubs. In some cases, the shrubs were growing right in the tufas themselves, and hiding them. And so it's interesting to go there now if you haven't walked this area, and if you're familiar with it, you may notice it looks like there's more tufa towers than there used to seem to be. And of course they were there, but they were the vegetation was hiding them. They were blackened by the fire, by the charring, but they weren't burnt. They weren't crumbled into nothingness. Some of the outer crust seems to get affected by the heat a little bit, but this is just an interesting, different look for tufa, if you will, if we're not used to it. And here's what's happened by April. Now, by this time, it's gotten to be late winter. For us, it's not really spring yet. We didn't have a really big winter, but we did have snow, and as I showed you a moment ago, we did get in there what the area looked like with some snow on the ground. And these are greasewood shrubs. The bases there the tops were burnt off, but the roots survived. And they, at this point, were just beginning to sprout. And if you go out there now, and months later, these sprouts are much taller, of course. So it's really interesting. It's one of the things that's most fascinating about fire ecology is the fact that there are there's vegetation that will not only be able to survive fire, not all of it does real well, depends how adapted to fire in that particular environment plants are. But there's also, this picture was taken a year after a fire that occurred in the Mono Basin, just north of Lundy Canyon, near where the power plant is up there, and along the Mill Creek Water Power Plant. And a year, and before this fire, each year there'd be a few flowers in among the sagebrush, but after the fire, it just went insanely beautifully, major display of wildflowers. Now, this isn't because they came and blew into this burnt area. This is because these seeds were waiting. They were there in the ground, waiting for the conditions that would wake them up and allow them to really thrive post-fire. And meanwhile, the shrubs, especially the sagebrush here, are not coming back yet, and really are very much slower response time. These kinds of flower displays of fire follower flowers, if you will, are something that will happen very abundantly for a while, and then each year there may be less and less, and then a seed bed gets deposited and a shrub community takes over again, and it may take a while until another fire returns before you see that kind of display. Here's another response. Just a few years ago, the Marina Fire occurred on the hillside just above and around Tioga Lodge, north of Levining, and an aspen grove right there north of Tioga Lodge was burned. Aspen groves are interesting because those trees are all pretty much one organism, interconnected by their roots. They think of them as a multi-clonal habit or group of trees that are really a tree. And so again, while the tops were burned, and in this case, aspens don't tend to resprout up high in the tops of the trees, like some trees will, like oak trees on the other side of the Sierra. These trees have been sprouting back. And I took this picture 2 years after the fire. This summer, these sprouts are about almost as tall as I am, about 5 foot tall. They're starting to really come back. So this grove will reestablish itself, and it's one of those things where aspen groves tend to be pretty wet, and they tend to not have fire very often at all. But when the right conditions happen, as did in this drought period, they still have a way to continue living in that area, taking advantage of the major root zone. It's there thriving underground, but not affected by the fire. Well, here's another thing that happens with some of the other species. Jeffrey pines that dominate our pine forest in this area have several adaptations to deal with the fact that naturally, frequently, fires would return frequently enough to make these adaptations by the vegetation be part of their evolution, part of how they've accommodated to the threat of fire. So Drafty pines have a thick bark that protects them. And near the ground, they tend to not have the older trees not have very many branches. And when they're younger, there'll be a lot of branching down low, but they self-prune as they get older. And the whole concept is that the living portion up high in the tree, you want the trees are keeping them away from ground fire. As long as a crown fire, that fires that move through the tops of the trees, as long as those don't happen, these adaptations are very much beneficial for the tree. In fact, I'll talk about not in our area, but giant sequoias in a moment. Some trees and some other plants actually take advantage of fire to clear out competition around them to allow that to happen, and then to create seed beds for the timing of release of their own seeds. So Jeffreys are interesting. I wanted to remind us, think back to something. Today it's smoky outside as I talk, but that smoke is drifting in from the north of us, coming quite a ways, and it's just hazy. But in this big fire year of 2020, after all those lightning fires got started, one of the things that affected us in this region very much was smoke, not the flames didn't reach us, but the smoke from the creek fire over on the other side of the Sierra. And there was a big blow up. The satellite image is showing the cloud lift and the movement of smoke from that fire in September. And the index was horrible for the air quality index for particulates in Levining. It pegged out. The numbers only go so high on the reading, and it was well beyond that. So this was September 8th in 2020. And what happened, and the explanation for that affected us with the smoke so much for such a period of time, was that over on the west side of the Sierra, has been a number of factors. And of course, we've been in drought, dry, hot, very hot conditions for quite some time. Under those conditions, the pine forests of the other side of the Sierra, the ponderosa pine dominated forests, have not been able to defend themselves because there wasn't enough water, basically, to allow them to defend themselves against beetle attacks. And usually these trees have a way to flood out a beetle. When a beetle's laying its eggs in the bark of these trees, the tree can use the pitch of the tree, if there's enough water available, will be the thing where they fight back with. So anyway, in California in recent years, these major mortality areas of trees, dead trees, have become another issue that's affecting how fire is behaving. And that incredible blow up of the creek fire is related to that. So this is a map of obviously the dead trees per acre put together by the Forest Service. And we have a little bit of this happening in the east side in some of our forests, but it's a real widespread phenomenon on the west side. And so on September 5th, there was a woman who provided this image. She took it out of an airplane window flying between Las Vegas and the Bay Area. And at that moment, this pyrocumulonimbus cloud. Pyro is fire, cumulonimbus are the rain-producing cumulus thunderheads that we see. Put that together, and what happens in a real intense fire, it can produce so much energy release that it rises incredibly high. And in this case, it penetrated into the stratosphere, over 8 miles high. And then it can generate its own weather right there locally. And sometimes it produces rain. It certainly can produce lightning. And this was one of the reasons why the Eastern Sierra as the winds delivered such an incredible amount of burnt tree matter, smoke, it to us. That's why we ended up getting days and days of smoke, including one particular one. This is September 16th, where out my living room window, it looked like this in the middle of the daytime, red sky and very dark and very interesting and kind of scary. But it's interesting in some ways. This was high elevation smoke, and it wasn't the worst of the smoky days we had in terms of health. It wasn't right on the ground and causing that kind of thing where you step out the door and can taste and smell the smoke. It was just psychologically very kind of interesting. And it was not just us. At this time, there were fires in Northern California that were producing this kind of an effect in the Bay Area, and it made the national news and international news. Pictures of the Bay Bridges and the red sky. So smoke is part of the problem we perceive and something we have to endure. But smoke exposure, smoke is part of also something that comes with natural fire, and just the quantity will depend. We'll talk about what's happening lately with the kind of fires we've got. But there are, because smoke comes with fire, plants and vegetation communities not only adapt with adaptations to the flame and the heat, but they also have adapted to smoke. And in some cases, smoke is beneficial to pine forests, helping to limit insect infestation. This plant is not a local one. It's in the chaparral communities of Southern California, but whispering bells are a real beautiful little plant that will be flowers, a lot of years, but the conditions for their flowering are improved by smoke, and all of a sudden they start to really do a flowering thing after in response to the chemicals of smoke. And so just one of those things to keep in mind as we look out the window and wonder why we have to endure the smoke. There are a lot of things happening. I want to broaden this a little bit to the other part of the state. Down in the eastern part of Southern California, in the Mojave Desert, just south of us, the Joshua tree habitat there is not an area that would normally carry much fire very often at all. And so the Joshua trees and the other vegetation of the desert are not really fire adapted. They don't show the kind of responses and features that many other areas do in terms of fire ecology. And yet they're starting to burn. And what's been happening in recent years is that, recent decades, more and more nitrate pollution has been, from blowing out of the urban areas of Southern California, has been deposited and has been fertilizing grasses to grow where they don't used to grow, and mostly non-native grasses. And the grasses are flashy fuel. They ignite easily and they move through these Joshua tree forests. And this has become a new problem. And it's a human cause there that's pretty obvious that it's happening. But along with the heat and dryness of climate change, there's a lot of concern about the ability of Joshua trees to deal with what they're being subjected with right now. Other things that are happening just in the last recent years, some of the fires have become mega fires, a number of them in 2020, and there's some of that happening again this year with the Dixie Fire. And those mega fires are producing these incredible energy releases, something like that pyrocumulonimbus photo I showed you a moment ago with the Creek Fire. This fire was a few years ago near Redding, and there's video on the internet about this where you can see this fire nado, this whole column we're looking at was actually rising, but also spinning like a tornado, and heat generated tornado, and very extreme, very difficult for the firefighters at this point to do anything near the, even at around the edges of this, because they don't know where it's going to move and what the winds will do next. So this is something that has been reported this year. I saw in regards to the Dixie Fire. This extreme fire behavior is something that the firefighters are reporting as a phenomenon that's really happening more and more recently. So what is happening, and how do we understand some of that? What can we think about in terms of the history part of this story? This is a poster that was part of a period of time back in the early 1900s, the beginnings of the 20th centuries, when the U.S. Forest Service was created in 1905, and then a big debate started because the Forest Service was in the business of growing trees as a crop, essentially, in those years especially, and things have changed. But so these quotes are basically demonizing fire and saying, that fire is going to burn up the little young trees that we want for reproduction in the forest. We must attempt to keep it out absolutely. And whether that was a good idea at the time, a century later, it appears that it was not. That more, a broader understanding of fire ecology really says that a lot of what we're experiencing today in certain parts of certain kinds of vegetation, like the pine forests, is a product of really dense forests where we're too successful at keeping fire out for too long and not allowing the thinning elements of fire to happen as they were naturally before that. So Smokey Bear came along to add his message to this effort to really try to control fire. I'm happy to say that even though Smokey's been around since 1949, I think it was, but this campaign used to be very much focused on basically a part of that demonizing fire concept, and now Smokey's message is a little more broader, where he's basically saying, there are good fires. We need to basically not let people start fires that shouldn't be started, and so I like this poster, by the way, one of my favorite Smokey posters. And so as this decade or the century of fire suppression continued on, we got more and more sophisticated, more and more equipment to help out with the battles. And that California has a really large fleet now of firefighting aircraft, our own Air Force, if you will, for just focused on that purpose. But I want to show you 3 pictures. Let me go back to the first one that really I think for these particular forests that were affected by fire suppression and now threatened. These 3 pictures I'm going to show you tell the story very well. These are giant sequoias in the Mariposa Grove of Yosemite National Park over the hill from us. And this is 1890. Note the group of what look like little teeny people, they're full-size people standing next to these massive giants. Redwood groves, there we go. Redwood groves, so giant sequoias, are one of those species that very much is adapted to frequent but low intensity ground fires. And so you'll see on this picture on the left, where I'm circling here, a big fire scar. The redwood's bark is really good, very thick. It's got a lot of tannin, a chemical that is resistant to fire. So when a fire does happen in its base, sometimes some of that will burn, but the tree stays alive. And these trees have stayed alive, of course, for thousands of years. They're really ancient things. They have more adaptations. Notice no limbs on these big mature trees close to the ground, like we talked about with the pines. They have cones that will open up their seeds when a fire, the heat of a fire occurs, heat rising up enough to reach where the cones are hanging in the trees, and then the seeds will be released. Or if the cones are on the ground, they'll open up on the ground. And after a fire, then there's no competing vegetation. But take a look at what happened. So the policy of the National Park Service was basically dictated as the national policy of the Forest Service in all of its land management, which was, put all the fires out as much as they could. And by 1970, there's that same tree, this one with the fire scar on the left. The other trees are there, but they're hidden by an invasion of young fir trees that like to grow in shady areas. And they come in very successfully underneath the canopy of the big trees. And at this point, the sequoias, for which the park was created to protect, were at incredible risk, because at this point a ground fire would be carried up high and up into the crowns, the living crowns of the giant sequoia trees, and kill them if it had happened. But instead, happily, in this particular case, the National Park Service began in the 1970s a program of thinning out and then burning and then allowing fire to move through again on the ground around these trees. And notice the charred marks around the base of the trees. Here's that same tree with the big fire scar. Here's Janet, my wife, standing there to help you, remind you how big these trees are, how small we are in comparison. But the Park Service in this particular area has done a good job at changing their policy in recognition of what the fire ecology needs are of this particular habitat. They also are doing things like burning in the meadow. The Miwok and the Kuzetika Paiute, who had lived in parts of the Yosemite National Park lands before there were any folks out of Europe, the Spanish and Mexican folks, and then others in the gold rush. They used to burn a lot. It's recorded in the ash layers of the grounds in places like Yosemite Valley. And one of the reasons they burned these meadows was to keep the oak trees from moving in and turning it in, and other kinds of trees, into a different kind of habitat. The meadows provided all kinds of vegetation for basketry, for food, for wildlife that they were interested in cultivating. And so the national park is doing like burns in there too, burns. Oops. So prescribed burns, what is that? Prescribed burn is a fire that's lit for management purposes when the conditions are of fuel, moisture, and weather, wind, the factors that will affect just how hot and how widespread a fire might become are right and fit the recipe that prescribed burn specialists work with. It's not just a casual thing to light fire in the wildlands, and unfortunately, it's been so closely regulated that there's really not enough of it that has been happening over the decades, even since the 70s, as it started to become reinstituted as a policy. But this is a fire in prescribed burn in the Jeffrey Pine Forest of the Eastern Sierra. And I wanted to basically honor Pete Hine. He provided this photo. He died a few years ago. He was a fuels officer here in our part of the world. And you see that the fire is doing what they want. It's moving along on the ground. It's burning out lower branches. It's not climbing up high into the tops of this tree. And there's some smoke involved, and the smoke has its benefits, as we talked about. But one of the things to keep in mind in this little pile burning exercise, gather the dead stuff, pile it up, and then burn it. This is below Mono City along Mill Creek some years ago now. There's smoke, and but compare this, if you will, to the smoke events that are associated with these big fires and the big mega fires and the fires that burn for months. These fires were out within a day. And that's part of the concept, is that you can regulate against smoke because of the air quality concerns. But if you overregulate it so that they can never do any of this kind of burning, you're fighting against something that is inevitable in our environment, the need for the fire, the landscape that is adapted to and will return fire at pretty predictable intervals. But if you say air quality, means you can't ever produce the smoke that comes with them, then you've got a dilemma. And so that's one of those issues that's being looked at. These are piles ready to be burned in the lake basin above Mammoth. They did a lot of work in recent years to do the thinning, to create these piles, and now they're looking for the optimum time to do burning. One of the things that you can do, let's see here, if I can get this to advance. there we go, is wait until there's snow on the ground, not too deep, but snow that will help keep the fire from spreading. This was a pile burning going on of some pretty big material. Two firefighters that were burning on right off Highway 88 in the El Dorado National Forest. They did this along the corridor of the highway. It's probably helping. I hope it's helping some right now in terms of a fire that's going right now in the El Dorado National Forest north of Highway 88. But in the rest of the forest that is one of those big damaging fires right now that's affecting a lot of people and their structures and homes. So I want to not completely ignore the rest of the story. In California, one of the big fire issues is the shrub lands. We have coastal sage scrub, like this picture here near the coast. We have chaparral, and most of the coastal hills and down onto the flats in the old days were chaparral communities. And chaparral is a plant community that burns incredibly hot. It burns frequently, and it burns typically associated with the fall Santa Ana winds. So here's a map of where chaparral as a species type of plant community is found, mostly where along the coast ranges and the coastal valleys, and that's where a very significant portion of the population of California has been planted, has put itself. This picture over here that looks so confusing is San Diego County. Lots and lots of people living in this area, and these fire perimeters that are mapped here, they overlap a lot, and they overlap in a rather short period of decades. And that's one of the interesting things that's a little different than what I showed you in the communities around near Mono Lake, for example. In chaparral, it has become very evident. The scientists know that if the wind is blowing strong enough, even recently burned areas that have some vegetation come back will burn again. And they don't very adequately control the next fire. It's a difference between the kinds of intensity and resins, the chemical resins in these plants, and these intense winds again. Have we got a theme going here? Wind is a major element in what happens with wildfire in California. So here's a picture of the Laguna area in Southern California. This isn't a fire that's now, been quite a few years, but fire approaching. It's one of those things where those flame fronts are there, and keep in mind that the wind is blowing and embers are what we can't see in a picture like this. Here's down in San Diego County, this community of Scripps, and this community was, the flame front was incredibly scary. It was approaching. The houses were built to try to be fire resistant, but what really saved them is that, notice that the smoke is blowing back away from the houses in this picture. The wind shifted, and what had been burning towards them for several days suddenly turned back on itself, and that's really what saved this particular community. This flame height that chaparral can produce is insanely scary. It's a sign of just how much of the sun's energy has been captured in the plant vegetation by photosynthesis, stored there to build up the plant carbohydrates, and then can be released by fire. This house actually, I understand, survived. It looks like it has some cleared, good clearance of vegetation around it. But also, again, the wind is blowing away from it in this picture. So this is now what, 2003. So that's 18 years ago in San Diego County. So those are all, part of the story, but one that affects not just chaparral and not just Southern California, but every one of these fires that we talk about, is the fact that when wind's associated with it, embers can be blown over a mile away from where the scary flame front is, so that the big flames may not be, and often are not, the most important element as to deciding whether a structure is going to survive. The ability of bits of flying ember to land, find them something, their way into something that is not, that allows a flyer just to get ignited in a small way and then take off, that's part of the problem. And so we talk about defensible space. The importance, there's plenty of things that the land management agencies are doing and need to do to reduce and to impact what happens out in the wildlands. But those are folks who live in the wildland urban edge, in the wildland urban interface, have plenty to do too, and plenty of responsibility. This is a picture of problems, obviously, waiting to happen. Think about embers and what you see in this picture. So choice of roof is one thing. How close vegetation is to that, and why there, besides the needles here, why there's a cord running across this roof, I have no idea, electrical cord. But roof fires are one of the ways that houses basically are destroyed. The walls tend to be not very susceptible to embers, depending on what they're made of. There are certain materials that are really fire resistant, but once a roof gets going, a house is in big trouble, and we don't want that to happen. And so there are different kinds of roofs. Many of the roofs in this part of the world, in recent years, have become metal, very good choice. But there are other choices that are fire resistant. But I still, even though this has an asphalt shingle roof and all, I see a number of things here that don't fit in well with the defensible space concept of the things that a homeowner can do to help the house be more self-protective, even without firefighters on hand. For example, this open deck, that's an invitation for embers or flames to move in under the deck. And of course, heat rises, and that's a terrible place to start a fire. The materials itself that the house is built on, and the crowding by the vegetation, all of those things. So to not just negatives, here's a local house friends of ours built, and I can't see anything wrong with this. They've done a lot of good things to think about both the exterior material, the stucco, the metal roof. Their deck is enclosed and low to the ground here, but especially the important point is it's enclosed, and there's no vegetation crowding right up to the house. Those are things that can really help. The type of windows, of course, most of us in this part of the world already have multi-pane windows that will help against heat shattering. An old single pane window doesn't do well against fire either. And then there's the structures, but there's also the space around the structures, and how much of this is possible for a particular landowner depends, of course, on where you live and how much land you have to control. But the concept here with defensible space is that if we do this preliminary work around a home, focused most closely on what's right near the house and keeping that lean and clean and green, and then doing thinning without denuding the ground, but thinning out as much as, if possible, 100 feet. 30 feet is a key distance, but whatever you can do, and then doing it again the next year as things grow back, and doing it again. This is a never-ending story. It's a never-ending part of living in the wildland urban interface, trying to be ready. And here's one that people don't think much about. This is my firewood stack at my house, and I'm trying to do my best to keep these cords, multiple cords of dry firewood, distant from my home. The numbers are kind of interesting. You would not want to stack the equivalent of a cord of firewood. Would be the equivalent of 160 gallons of gasoline up against your house, and when a fire might come sometime. Now, in the winter, when there's snow on the ground and I don't want to plow, walk through 2 or 3 feet of snow, it used to happen at least to get out to my wood, I will move some wood in closer to my house on a porch. Cover it with a fireproof tarp if you've got that. They are available. But in a blizzard condition, that's fine. There's not going to be a fire coming. But really need to think about where to stack firewood. Stacking it up against the house, as a matter of course, all through the fire season is like bringing the fuel problem back to right up against your house. So a couple of other just things to wrap up. In recent years, one reason why I have a second edition of this Introduction to Fire in California book out is that there's been some new questions to ask and new things that have become themes in regards to these questions. One is the number of fires being started by utility lines during wind events usually. And this was in the 2018 Camp Fire that affected Paradise, among other places, and very big tragedy there. And this is a PG&E worker running from a place where a pole has obviously come down, but coming down and sparking as a source of ignition has become a real big concern, threatening the companies, the utility companies, in terms of their viability. And this just came out in July. PG&E, the headline says, vowing to bury 10,000 miles of California power lines, finally. It's a very expensive way for them to go, and they resisted this for a very long time, but apparently that's coming, and that's good news. And this needs to be updated. This little graph about the largest California wildfires, just in terms of acreage. You know, of course, how we look at the severity of a fire is not just acreage, but how much impact it's had on structures and how much impact it's had on deaths of humans at times. But notice the number of years. This was a year ago that most of the the year 2020, basically, we had all these record-breaking numbers, and this chart goes all the way back to 1932. There was a big fire that particular year. That's why they started it there. But there is something happening, and it seems like, especially in the last decade, especially in the last few years, there have been more and more mega fires. It coincides with severe drought, severe heat, and which prepares the ground to be ready to be, for an ignition source that then takes off. And if you get the wind to go with it, then you've got what explains what's happening here. And lurking behind that is the change that's happened in the last couple of decades, especially with our atmosphere and with the climate crisis. And I could show you lots of pictures and graphs and things about the climate crisis, but here's one that focuses on temperature. And this is from last year during the midst of that big fire season. And the heat factor is certainly there, and it's and this year in 2021, I've been hearing about the incredible month of July as being the hottest on record ever in this part of the world. So we have something that's happened that we have been responsible for with the changes we brought to the greenhouse effect up in our atmosphere through the burning of and release of fossil fuels, and it is causing part of this story to part of the major explanation for why things have changed recently. So last year, 4.2 million acres burned in California. That's a big number. It's a very daunting number. We're up over 1 million acres so far. Here it is, just a little past mid-August in this season. We'll see what happens. But I want to not ignore the fact that the records that we can find from fire, they study fire records basically by looking at tree rings and charring and a host of things, ash in the soil, indicate that about 5 million acres were experiencing fire. I don't want to say burnt. I certainly don't want to say destroyed. I want to say experiencing fire each year before the Spanish arrived in California. Those were the natural fires lit by lightning, and the fires lit by the local people living here, the indigenous people of California. And the difference here is that there was much more moderate fire behavior associated as those 5 million acres experienced fire. They came back, fires were frequent, and they were, when they were set by the Indian people, they were set with purposes in mind, with certain particular areas in mind. And while they didn't go out and then fight them, they did think about where the fire was going to go and put itself out eventually, that kind of concept. Today, what's changed is we have 40 million, almost 40 million now, Californians in the state, and high percentage, a good percentage of them live in areas that are part of the wildland urban interface. So the question to leave with you is that with so many of us in these areas, what can we do? Are we just stuck with this situation? We certainly are helped create it. We, the society, our choices in the last century, and we're dealing with the bear by the tail that we can't let go of now that we partially created by fire exclusion policies that were too successful. 95% of the fires started in California are put out. It's the beyond that, the ones that take off, that we're experiencing the problems with now. But that because we did keep so many fires out that would naturally have been part of what the regime of moderate fire and frequent fire used to be, we are living with a challenge right now, and maybe we can move beyond that. But it's going to take a long time to also resolve this other major dilemma that the globe is facing of the global climate crisis. So we need to think about that. I would love to be able to say that Californians can become another one of the many fire adapted species within this state. And I put this quote at the start and didn't read it to you, but maybe you read it. Professor Harold Biswell was a forestry professor at UC Berkeley, one of the pioneers in bringing fire back to landscapes that had lost fire, basically through our policy. And I like this quote: "Keep in mind that fire is a natural part of the environment, about as important as rain and sunshine." He's getting at the influence that it had on the evolution of the vegetation and of we haven't talked about it, but of a lot of the wildlife in this state as a major factor shaping the state. And it isn't going away. It's part of what we have to deal with if we are to survive and be part of comfortably part of the environment of California. So thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me do this a second time, because it wasn't recorded the first time. And if you get to see this on YouTube or whatever, I hope you'll take a look at the new edition of the book. This is the cover of the new book, and it just came out August 20th. So thank you very much.